When police officers showed up ready to raid her home, this black woman didn't panic, didn't run, and didn't back down. With nothing but her voice, her courage, and her knowledge of the law, she turned the whole situation around in a way nobody expected. The evening began like any other. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with soft shades of purple and gold. Inside her home, the woman moved quietly, tidying up her kitchen and humming to herself. The day had been long, but now she was finally at peace. She was thinking about making a cup of tea before bed when it happened. The sudden, thunderous pounding on her front door. The sound was so sharp and forceful that the walls seemed to vibrate. Her heart leapt into her throat. For a moment, she froze in place, listening carefully, trying to make sense of the noise. The knocking came again, louder this time, like someone was trying to break the door down. Then came the voices, firm, commanding, and filled with authority. "Police, open up." Her hands trembled, but only for a second. She took a deep breath, forcing her body to stay calm. She walked over to the window, carefully parting the curtain just enough to see outside. What she saw made her chest tighten. A row of police cars lined the street, their red and blue lights flashing wildly, reflecting off the nearby houses. Several officers stood on her porch, their fists balled, their faces hard with impatience. The neighborhood was alive with curiosity. Lights flickered on in houses up and down the street. Faces appeared in windows, shadows moved behind curtains, and doors cracked open as people stepped out to see what was happening. The once quiet street now buzzed with whispers and speculation. Some neighbors clutched their phones, already recording the scene. Children peeked from behind their parents, wide-eyed with confusion and fear. It was clear that this moment was about to become the center of attention. Inside, the woman's pulse quickened, but her mind was sharp. She had seen things like this before, too many times in fact. She knew how quickly a situation like this could spiral out of control if she wasn't careful. But she also knew something else, something that gave her strength in that very instant. She knew her rights. She reminded herself that fear would not protect her, but knowledge would. She whispered softly to herself, "Stay calm. Don't let them break you." The pounding on the door grew harsher. An officer's voice barked, "Open up now. This is a raid." The word raid echoed in her ears, sharp and heavy. She felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. But instead of giving in, she planted her feet firmly on the floor, as if grounding herself against a storm. She called out through the closed door, her voice steady, strong, and louder than she expected. "Do you have a warrant?" There was a pause outside, just a brief silence, but enough to shift the energy. The officers glanced at one another. She could see them through the peephole, their jaws tightening, their postures stiffening. One of them shouted back, "Open the door and we'll explain everything inside." But she didn't budge. She repeated her words, even clearer this time. "If you don't have a signed warrant, you are not coming into my house." Her voice carried out into the street, echoing in the night air. Neighbors gasped, some murmuring their approval, others stunned by her courage. She wasn't just speaking to the officers anymore, she was speaking to everyone watching. It wasn't just about her door or her home. It was about the principle, about the rights that belonged to her and to everyone standing silently in the dark around her. She felt her fear melting away, replaced by something far more powerful. It was a kind of courage that came from deep within, a kind of courage that history had carved into her very being. She remembered stories of her grandmother, who had faced injustice with the same unshakable will. She thought of her community, of all the people who had been silenced or bullied into submission. And she knew in this very moment that she was not going to be one of them. The knocking stopped for a second. The flashing lights outside kept spinning, but the officers hesitated. They weren't expecting resistance. They weren't expecting a woman who stood firm with nothing but her voice. The night was thick with tension, the kind that makes time stretch and every second feel like an eternity. She took another deep breath, steadied her heartbeat, and waited for their next move. That night, behind a closed door and with the eyes of her community upon her, she made a silent promise to herself. No matter what happened, she would not let them strip away her dignity, her safety, or her rights. This was her home, her ground, and she would stand on it with every ounce of strength she had. The silence that followed her demand for a warrant didn't last long. Within seconds, the knocking returned, louder and sharper than before, as though the officers were determined to break the door down by sheer force. One of them shouted, his tone clipped and aggressive, "We don't have time for this. Open the door now." The words were meant to intimidate, but instead, they sparked a fire inside her. She felt her shoulders straighten, her chin lift just slightly. Fear was still there, pounding in her chest like a second heartbeat, but it no longer controlled her. She had chosen courage and she would stand on it like a rock in the middle of a storm. The officers barked orders to one another, their radios crackling with noise. From inside her home, she could hear the restless shuffle of boots on her porch, the sound of weapons and gear shifting. It was meant to remind her of their power, meant to make her submit. But she knew the truth. Their authority ended at her front door unless they had the paper to prove otherwise. She repeated herself again, her voice calm but loud enough to pierce the night air. No warrant, no entry. The neighbors had gathered closer now, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. Some filmed quietly, holding up their phones like shields. Others whispered encouragement, their words carried on the night breeze. Stay strong, don't let them in. Every voice, every watchful eye gave her more strength. She realized she wasn't alone. Her stand was becoming more than a private struggle. It was turning into a lesson for everyone watching. One officer stepped forward, his voice booming with authority. "Ma'am, if you don't open this door right now, we will force our way inside." His hand hovered dangerously close to his holstered weapon, though he hadn't drawn it. The threat in his words wasn't just about entering her home, it was about breaking her spirit, about showing the crowd that resistance was useless. But she refused to give him that victory. She steadied her breathing and answered clearly, her words deliberate and unwavering. "The law is on my side. Without a warrant signed by a judge, you have no right to be here. I will not open this door." Her voice carried a weight that even surprised her. It wasn't shaky or timid. It was powerful, like a teacher instructing a classroom, like a parent protecting her children. The officer clenched his jaw, frustration etched on his face. He wasn't used to people knowing their rights so clearly. He expected fear, confusion, submission, but instead he was met with knowledge, confidence, and strength. He turned to his fellow officers, muttering under his breath, but the microphones clipped to their shoulders betrayed the tension in his voice. The whole neighborhood could see his anger, and it only highlighted the woman's calmness in comparison. Minutes felt like hours. The officers tried different tactics. One softened his tone, speaking like he was offering her a choice. "Look, ma'am, if you just open the door we can get this over with quickly. Nobody wants any trouble here." His attempt at persuasion sounded hollow, a rehearsed line that didn't hold up under the weight of the flashing lights and weapons outside her home. She saw through the act instantly. "If you don't have a warrant," she replied, "then you have no reason to be here. Leave." The tension grew so thick that even the air seemed heavy. Some neighbors shifted uneasily, worried about what might happen next. Others nodded with admiration, whispering things like, "She's so brave, and that's exactly what you're supposed to say." The crowd's faith in her strengthened her own resolve. At one point an officer tried to bluff. He waved a stack of papers in the air, claiming it was all the authority they needed. But through the peephole she caught a glimpse, and her sharp eyes noticed there was no judge's signature, no specific address matching hers. It was nothing but a trick, a flimsy attempt to scare her into surrender. She didn't fall for it. "That's not a valid warrant," she called out firmly. "You're wasting your time." The street had become a stage, and every second of this confrontation was unfolding before dozens of witnesses. For the first time the power balance shifted. It was no longer the police commanding the scene, it was her. With every confident word, with every refusal to back down, she turned their show of force into a display of weakness. Finally, after another round of banging and empty threats, the shouting began to quiet. The officers weren't giving up, but hesitation was creeping into their stance. They exchanged glances, frustration evident, their voices lowering as they spoke among themselves. The woman on the other side of the door stood tall, her body trembling with adrenaline but her voice unshaken. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore, it was a battle of wills. And in that battle, it was becoming clear. The side with weapons and flashing lights wasn't as powerful as the side with courage, calmness, and the truth. She had drawn her line and she wasn't moving. The air outside buzzed with tension, but inside her home, the woman felt strangely steady. Her hands still trembled slightly, yet her voice carried with a strength that surprised even her. She knew the officers were trying to intimidate her, trying to force her into giving up what was rightfully hers, her safety, her dignity, her rights. But she also knew something more powerful than their shouting, their weapons, or their flashing lights. She knew the law. She reminded herself of everything she had read and studied, the conversations she had heard in community meetings, the lessons passed down from older voices in her family. She remembered her grandmother's words, "If you don't know your rights, they'll convince you that you don't have any." That memory lit a fire in her chest. She wasn't just standing in her doorway tonight as one woman, She was standing with the strength of generations who had fought for the right to live freely. The officers tried again, their voices pushing through the heavy night air. "Ma'am, if you don't comply, we'll take this to the next level." But she didn't waver. Her voice rang out, calm and clear. "The Fourth Amendment protects me from unlawful searches and seizures. Without a signed warrant, you cannot step into my home. I know the law and I know my rights." Her words carried down the street, and the crowd of neighbors stirred. Some people nodded with approval. Others whispered to each other, repeating what she had said. The children who peeked from behind their parents' legs listened wide-eyed, as if they were hearing something powerful for the very first time. In that moment, her stand became more than just about herself. It became a lesson, a demonstration of courage that spread like wildfire through her community. The officers' faces shifted. They weren't prepared for this. Too many times people had panicked, given in, or opened their doors without asking questions. But not her. She stood in defiance, not with violence or rage, but with something far more threatening to those who abused their authority: knowledge. Every word she spoke was like a shield, every fact she recalled another brick in the wall that protected her home. She didn't just stand in silence either. She kept speaking, filling the air with truth so there was no room left for their lies. "You cannot come into my home unless you show me a warrant with my name and my address on it, signed by a judge. That's the law. Anything less is harassment." The firmness in her tone echoed across the street. Her words were not only protecting her but planting seeds of awareness in everyone listening. Frustration rippled through the group of officers. One of them snapped, "Lady, you're making this harder than it has to be." But she knew better. Harder for who? Harder for them because they weren't used to being challenged. Harder for them because they relied on fear and compliance, not on law and justice. She stood taller, her eyes locked on the door. "The only ones making this harder," she said firmly, "are the people trying to break into my house without legal grounds." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Someone shouted in support, "That's right." Another yelled, "Show the warrant." Phones were raised higher, capturing every second. The balance of power had shifted even further. The officers, who had marched up to her house with confidence, now looked unsettled under the bright lights of cameras and the weight of the law being spoken against them. Inside, her heart still raced, but she felt her fear transforming into something else: conviction. Knowledge gave her the courage to resist, but it also gave her clarity. She understood exactly what was happening. They had expected her to fold. They had expected her to hand over her rights in the heat of the moment. But instead, she turned the entire situation on its head. They were the ones on the defensive now. She pressed her palm flat against the door, steadying herself as she spoke once more. "I will not be bullied. I will not be tricked. You cannot enter this house without lawful authority, and I will not allow you to violate my rights." Her words were not a plea. They were a declaration, sharp and unbreakable. The officers shifted uneasily. Some muttered into their radios, others looked away from the crowd's piercing gaze. The night that had begun with a promise of control was slipping through their fingers. And standing in her doorway, with nothing but her courage and her knowledge of the law, she had turned the raid into a standoff they could not win by intimidation alone. On that porch, with the entire neighborhood watching, she proved something simple yet powerful. Knowledge is more powerful than fear. And in that moment she became not just a woman protecting her home, but a voice for everyone who had ever felt powerless. The night air hung heavy with the weight of the standoff. Flashing red and blue lights still painted the street, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. The woman remained at her door, standing tall, her voice steady and her resolve unshaken. On the other side, the officers shifted restlessly, their authority unraveling in front of an entire community. The crowd had grown larger now. People who had been hesitant at first were stepping closer, holding up their phones, recording every second. The power dynamic was shifting and everyone could feel it. One officer finally broke the tense silence. His voice was low but edged with frustration as he muttered to his partner, "Check the paperwork again." The officer who had earlier waved a stack of documents flipped through them under the harsh glare of his flashlight. His brow furrowed as he turned page after page. The woman inside watched closely through her peephole, every movement confirming what she had suspected all along. They didn't have the authority to be there. A quiet murmur rippled through the officers, their hushed conversation carrying just enough for the nearest neighbors to hear. "Wrong address," one of them admitted reluctantly. The words were faint, but they carried like thunder through the crowd. A wave of gasps and whispers followed. Some neighbors raised their voices, "Wrong house? Are you serious?" Others jeered, You came here ready to raid an innocent woman's home. The tension that had been building all evening was beginning to collapse back onto the officers themselves. The woman seized the moment. Her voice cut through the noise, sharp and unyielding. You see? You never had a right to be here. This is my home, not the address you're looking for. Now leave, immediately. Her words weren't just for the officers anymore. They were for the entire community watching, a public demand for justice in real time. She was no longer on the defensive, she was in control. The lead officer's jaw clenched, his face tightening under the judgmental stares of the neighborhood. He tried to hold his composure, but it was slipping away. "Ma'am, we were acting on information we were given," he said stiffly, as if that excused the flashing lights, the shouting, and the attempt to storm her home. But the woman wasn't moved by excuses. She had been seconds away from having her door broken in, from being treated like a criminal in her own house. His explanation meant nothing compared to the violation she had nearly endured. "You made a mistake," she declared firmly. "But your mistake could have destroyed my life. Don't stand here pretending it's nothing. Leave my property now." Her voice rose, and the crowd behind her roared in agreement. The chorus of support made it impossible for the officers to continue pretending they were in control. Neighbors shouted louder now, emboldened by her courage. "You've got no warrant," one yelled. "Get off her porch," another demanded. Phones captured every second, ensuring that no part of this confrontation could be erased or rewritten later. The officers were boxed in, trapped between their pride and the undeniable truth. The tension reached its peak. For a moment, it felt as though the officers might try one last act of defiance, one last push to reclaim their authority. But the weight of the crowd, the cameras, and the woman's unyielding stance made it clear, any wrong move now would be a disaster for them. Slowly, grudgingly, the lead officer stepped back. "All right," he muttered under his breath, motioning to his team. "Let's move out." One by one the officers began to retreat. Their heavy boots thudded against the porch steps as they made their way back to their vehicles. The flashing lights reflected off their retreating figures, no longer a symbol of power but of humiliation. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, voices rising like a wave that washed away the fear of the night. The woman stood still, watching until the last officer stepped off her property. She didn't smile, not yet. This wasn't a victory she had chased for pride. This was survival, dignity, and justice all wrapped into one. The moment the final car door slammed and the convoy began to pull away, the crowd's energy burst into celebration. Neighbors clapped her on the back, called out her name, and raised their voices in praise. "You did it," someone shouted. "You stood up to them," another cried. Children looked at her with awe, as though she had done something magical. But in her heart, she knew it wasn't magic at all. It was courage and it was knowledge. As the flashing lights disappeared into the distance, the street fell back into darkness and calm. The woman finally exhaled, her body relaxing for the first time since the pounding on her door had begun. She leaned against the wall, tears prickling her eyes, not of fear but of relief and triumph. She had faced down a raid not with weapons but with wisdom. Not with force but with resolve. And in the end the truth had won. That night marked the turning point. The officers had come with the intention of overpowering her, of invading her space without justification. But she had flipped the script. She showed her neighbors, her community, and even those officers themselves that the most powerful weapon a person can hold is the knowledge of their rights, and the courage to demand they be respected. The night had grown quiet again, but the echoes of what had happened still lingered in the air. The flashing lights were gone, the heavy boots had marched away, and the street, once tense with fear, now hummed with relief and celebration. Neighbors remained gathered outside, speaking in hushed tones or raising their voices in bursts of admiration for the woman who had stood her ground. Some shook their heads in disbelief at how close the situation had come to disaster, while others lifted their phones high, replaying the footage they had captured of her fearless defense. Inside her home, the woman finally sat down, her body sinking into the couch as the weight of the night caught up with her. Her hands still tingled from the rush of adrenaline, and her heart was only just beginning to slow its frantic pace. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and allowed herself to feel the flood of emotion she had held back: fear, anger, relief, and finally, a swelling pride. She had done what so many people were too afraid to do. She had said no and she had made it stick. The doorbell rang softly, pulling her back to the present. For a split second, her muscles tensed, but when she looked through the peephole, she saw only her neighbors standing there. She opened the door, and they greeted her not with fear or pity but with applause. "You were incredible," one woman said, tears brimming in her eyes. I wish I had your strength. Another neighbor, an older man with gray hair, shook his head in amazement. I've lived on this street for 30 years, he said, and I've never seen anyone handle the police like that. You didn't just protect yourself, you taught all of us something tonight. She smiled humbly, though her voice was still steady when she spoke. I didn't do anything special. I just knew my rights. That's all any of us need, knowledge and the courage to use it. Her words carried the same weight as when she had spoken to the officers, and the crowd outside nodded in agreement. The videos began to spread almost instantly. By morning, clips of her calm defiance were circulating online, shared thousands of times with captions like, "This is how you stand up for your rights," and "Courage in the face of intimidation." The woman's name, once unknown outside her neighborhood, became a rallying cry for empowerment and awareness. People across the city, even across the country, watched her stand against injustice and felt stronger because of it. But for her, the victory was not about going viral or gaining recognition. It was about the lesson that had been proven in the most powerful way possible. No matter how intimidating the opposition, the truth of the law was stronger. She had faced officers who thought their uniforms gave them unchecked authority, and she had shown them, and everyone watching, that the law protected her just as much as it empowered them. Days later, the same neighbors who had crowded around her home returned, this time not out of concern but to thank her. They brought food, hugs, and words of gratitude. Some admitted they had never truly understood their own rights until they watched her. Parents told her their children wouldn't stop talking about her bravery. Even elders, who had lived through decades of fear and mistrust, looked at her with admiration and pride. "You gave us hope," one grandmother said softly, pressing her hands together. "You gave us proof that we don't always have to bow our heads." The woman received messages from strangers too, people who told her how her actions inspired them to learn more, to be ready if they ever faced something similar. In a world where fear often silenced the powerless, her refusal to give in had become a spark for change. She hadn't just shut down a raid, she had ignited awareness. And yet, through all the attention and praise, she remained grounded. "I didn't win alone," she reminded people. "It was the cameras, the voices, the witnesses, and the truth that stood with me." Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid, it means you stand even when you are. That's something we can all do. On the same porch where officers had once tried to force their way in, she now stood surrounded by her community, not as a victim but as a symbol of strength. The house that could have been broken into and violated was instead a fortress of dignity. The street that could have ended in fear and silence had instead become a place of empowerment. As the sun set on the days that followed, the memory of that night never faded. It became part of her story, her neighborhood story, and the larger story of people learning to protect themselves with courage and knowledge. And when she looked around at the faces of her neighbors, at the children who now played freely on the sidewalks without fear, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she had stood not just for herself but for everyone. That night, a raid had turned into a retreat. Fear had turned into strength. And one woman, with nothing but her voice and her rights, had turned the tide. Victory was hers, not just for one night but for a lifetime.